Nebraska, a place most people imagine as endless fields, quiet towns, and wide open skies. But if you stay out here long enough, if you listen to the wind and watch the roads after midnight, you'll realize this land holds stories far older and far darker than anything written in history books, because Nebraska has secrets. On lonely highways, voices are said to cry out from the trees, begging for justice that never came. Along the Missouri River, the spirits of two doomed lovers still fight a battle that didn't end with death. In the abandoned heart of the state, a town with a population of one somehow still feels crowded. And down by the Platte River, where the fog rises like fingers from the water, travelers swear a woman in white waits to lure them into the current. These aren't just campfire tales. These legends are carved into the land. Ask anyone who's lived here long enough. They'll tell you Nebraska is quiet, but it's never empty. Tonight, we're diving into 4 of the state's most unsettling stories. The screams beneath Seven Sisters Road, the ghost of the Blackbird Hill Lovers, the vanishing town of Monowi, and the witch of the Platte River. If you think you know Nebraska, you don't. Not yet. Welcome to the shadows of the Great Plains. They say the road remembers what the people forget. Drive south of Nebraska City on a night when the moon is a thin coin, and the corn presses, close to the black shoulder of the highway, and you'll find a place where the ordinary rules of the plains seem to loosen. The map will call it a county route. The GPS will offer turns and distances, but the locals, those who grew up listening to their grandparents, warnings, call it by another name. Seven Sisters Road. Say the words out loud and you'll hear 2 reactions. A laugh from the unconcerned, and a quieting, like someone has folded their hands to pray, from those who remember. The story reaches back to the ragged edges of settlement, when the Missouri bluffs still held the woods, and the river carved its own stubborn course. Families planted sod and raised barns, and out in the hollows people worked the land from dawn until their shoulders burned. It was hard country then, and hard things tend to breed hard stories. One of those stories centers on a family who kept to themselves on a homestead just off the bluff, an austere house with a porch that faced the road and 7 daughters, who rarely, if ever, walked the town square. They were girls with pale hands and slow smiles, and the father, a man shaped by the land and his own silence, moved through his fields like a shadow cut out of the late light. No one alive now can recite every detail with certainty. Some tell it like a courtroom account, precise and terrible. Others speak in hushed fragments that rattle like loose nails. A fever that took the mother, a loss that obdurately folded into the father's skin, a hunger for control that became something else. Whatever the truth, the night people remember most is the same. The father, they say, called his daughters to the hill, one after the other, taken by some private logic or madness only he felt, under the hollowed silhouette of an old oak that still leans over the earth like an accusation. The worst thing in the story happened. 7 young lives ended there, and one more, of the man who led them, was lost too, in a way people couldn't reconcile. Some versions end with the farmer found dead beneath the very same limbs. Others say he walked away and was never seen again. The graves were small and close together. The town tried to cover the wound with stones and seasons, but the hill refused to sleep. The first visitors in the 20th century treat the place like a dare. Teenagers would race toward the crest of the bluff, light straining into the trees, laughter loud enough to startle owls into flight. Then things changed. Cars would stall without warning. Radios, tuned to the steady hum of distant stations, would turn to silence and then play a hymn in some lengthened, slowed-down key. Headlights would flare white-hot and then gutter. The bravest who parked and stepped into the dark felt a pressure in the air, like someone pressing their palms flat on the back of your skull. And then, sometimes barely audible, sometimes clear as a bell, the sound of voices, not the rough roar of an engine or the high gasp of wind, but singing. 7 voices, old as bone and young as breath, lifting in a cadence that was almost a hymn, almost a child's game, notes folded into itself and then dissolved into the trees. Witnesses over the decades collected detail, like travelers pick up stamps in a passport. A trucker with decades on the road told an interviewer how his wheel tightened in his hands, as if an invisible hand had gripped it. He swore the road bent toward the drop-off the moment he passed the old oak. Two women driving home from a wedding remembered, years later, that their rearview mirror had filled with white figures that did not belong to their headlights. Later, the sheriff called their claims atmospheric anomalies. Retired schoolteacher, who still milked her cows at dawn, recalled how once, when the wind was wrong, a pale procession seemed to float between the rows of corn, daughters in simple, white dresses, faces turned toward the sky, feet never touching the soil. She stopped telling that story to passing strangers when they laughed. Those who listened came away quieter. There were investigators, too, amateur and professional, armed with tape recorders, cameras and thermometers. In the 70s, a trio of college students camped near the oak and left with swollen, insect-bitten legs and a tape that managed to record nothing but an opening crackle and then, faintly beneath the static, a low harmonic hum like wind through a glass bottle. The photographs sometimes showed nothing but empty trees and moonlight. Other times they held ghostly smudges that bent like smoke. One investigator swore he had captured the outline of 7 heads at the base of the tree in infrared, only for the image to corrupt when he tried to enlarge it. Every print a little more, washed out than the last until nothing remained but a circle of light. People like explanations. Geologists pointed to shifting ground and pocket gases, methane or the oddities of the bluff, producing light, refraction and sound anomalies. Psychologists consider the power of folklore. Go to a place expecting it to be haunted and your senses will layer itself into that expectation. Both are useful arguments, tidy in their reasoning, but they never quite account for the more intimate reports, the small, private terrors. A man who spent the night at the farmhouse years ago said he woke to the soft brush of fingers along his ankle and at the same time, the distinct feeling of being watched by 7 shadows balanced at the foot of the bed. He left his shoes outside, where they appeared muddy by morning, though the floor within was spotless. On the sole of one trainer, an imprint was pressed, not a tread pattern, but a shallow round bruise, like a thumbprint of the earth itself. There are warnings passed down like family recipes. Do not stop at the top of the hill on moonless nights. Do not count the dips between the knolls. Do not call to the sound if you hear it. Locals say the voices sometimes answer. Children who mimic the song will dream of hands, warm and small, pulling them into a tunnel of soft dirt. Hunters who disturb the underbrush find their dogs lost and return with the animal's eyes distant, uncomprehending. A farmer who cleared an old, weathered gravestone that had sunk and become indistinct discovered that the crops near that plot failed. For a season, even as the rest of his field thrived. He reburied the stone and the corn returned, fat and green, as if balance had been restored. Even the skeptic cannot help but notice the way dogs react to that stretch of road. Cars slow of their own accord when a mutt leans forward, ears pricked. The animal will not enter the shaded sloughs, and will sometimes whimper as if listening to a human voice between the trees. Newcomers are told these things not to frighten them, but to instruct them in humility. Some places in the world are layered with pastness. They carry the residue of other people's sorrow, and sorrow, if it is not acknowledged, will echo. There are modern oddities to the legend as well. A low bluish light sometimes hangs over the hill at twilight, like a lantern left to drift from a funeral procession. Cell reception thins there, as if the place has a private gravity that pulls signals into itself. On fog-heavy evenings, the silhouettes of white dresses appear in peripheral vision, noises that belong to the early morning. A lullaby hummed between breaths, a sound that feels like a last attempt at summoning someone who will not come back. Year after year, new travelers contribute new pieces. A ring lost, a watch found perfectly clean in leaf litter, a streak of old rope fiber tangled in the roots. It is tempting to ask a question of morality when one studies a story like this. What duty does a town have to the dead when those dead were themselves the victims of a living evil? The people who maintain the road and the families who own the private fields near the oak tree rarely speak to cameras. They are more likely to fold their hands and say that grief will find its own way to be heard. Some perform small rites, placing a bouquet, a carved stone, a string of faded holiday lights, and claim the nights are quieter afterward. Others bury their memories in practical work, mending fences, hauling grain. The balance holds, temporarily. And then there is the small mercy that sometimes arrives in the strangest forms. On a late autumn night several years ago, an elderly woman who grew up in the town took it upon herself to visit the graves. She walked with a candle and a tin cup of coffee and, by her account, she simply spoke aloud the names of the 7 as if reading them from a family Bible. Only once, she said, she heard a reply, not in sound but in weather, a single wind bolt that came straight up the road, tasted of river and leaves. When she left, the candle had not burned down but lay cold. The next morning, someone found a small, unmarked stone at the base of the oak with 7 initials faintly scratched across it. Some people cried, others did not. But after that night, for the first time in years, a man reported that his radio had barely pulsed. No crackle, no plea, but a single clear note rising up like a comb through silence. Legends don't need a tidy ending. They need a way to be lived and retold. Over the course of 100 years, the story of 7 sisters. Road has gathered all kinds, those who insist on the rational, those who sell trinkets at the county fair, solemn neighbors who cut briars at dawn, and each has left their mark. The road has become, in a way, a listening place. It holds what people throw at it: dare, curiosity, repentance, fear. Sometimes, under certain skies, it gives something back. If you ever find yourself driving that way, do not make a spectacle of it. Turn your headlights low, keep your windows up, and if you hear a song, listen without answering. There is a civility to the haunted. It asks to be acknowledged, but not summoned. If you are brave or foolish enough to stop at the crest and cut off your engine, you will learn how loud the silence can be. You may hear, faint as a thread and close enough to bite, the sound of something settling, rope on wood, breath through cloth, a chorus rehearsing a sorrow that never found resolution. Some people leave flowers, some leave stones. Some leave quietly and never speak of it again. A few leave and never return. The practical explanations will stand beside the ghost stories forever. Geography and atmosphere, cognitive bias and weather, they will always be important. But even the most thorough explanation does not erase the human weight of the place, the way a community gathered its story around that oak, how it has borne the grief and the memory and passed both along like a cup. 7 Sisters Road endures not because it is a perfect riddle, but because it is a wound that will not close. And as long as there are people who remember or dare, the road will remember them back. High above the quiet bends of the Missouri River, near the small town of Decatur, Nebraska, there's a lonely rise the locals call Blackbird Hill. To most, it's just another bluff overlooking the muddy waters of the Missouri. But to those who live nearby, it's a place of whispers, a hill that remembers everything. They say that every year, on October 17th, if you stand still and listen closely, you'll hear the echo of a woman's scream carried through the wind, a sound that doesn't belong to the living, but to a love that ended in fire and blood. Long before the towns and highways came, this land belonged to the Omaha tribe. Their great leader, Chief Blackbird, was said to have been buried right here, upright on his horse, facing the river so his spirit could forever watch over his people. But centuries later, settlers came, carving farms out of the sacred hills, building homes where the chief's shadow still lingered. Among the new settlers was a woman named Lydia, and her husband, William Millard, a wealthy but proud man who had built her a grand white house at the edge of the bluff. Theirs seemed like a storybook marriage at first, a house filled with laughter, with dinner parties and fine furniture hauled upriver from St. Louis. But the walls of that home hid something darker. Before William, Lydia had loved another man, a wanderer, a traveler, someone who had promised her the world before leaving to find his fortune. He had sworn he'd return, and for years she waited. But as the seasons passed and her family pressed her to marry, she gave up hope. She married William, a man who loved her fiercely, but whose temper could cut through calm like a blade. At first he adored her, showering her with gifts and devotion. Yet, as time went on, he began to notice the way she would stare out toward the river at dusk, her face filled with something he couldn't name. One evening, William asked, "What are you looking for out there?" Lydia smiled faintly and whispered, "Just listening to the river." But those words haunted him. Night after night, she would stand at that same window, her eyes glistening in the lamplight, staring into the distance. William began to wonder if her heart was still out there, with the man she once loved. Then, one fateful evening in October of 1885, as the sun sank red behind the horizon, a lone rider appeared on the dusty road below. His horse was worn, his clothes travel-torn, but his eyes burned with something familiar, something Lydia had dreamed of seeing again. The servant saw him first, shouting her name as he rode closer. "Lydia!" he called. And when she heard that voice, her hands trembled. She ran outside before anyone could stop her, her dress whipping around her in the wind. When they met, she fell into his arms. He told her he had returned, that he had finally built a life for them, and that he'd come back to take her away from the lonely hill. She cried, from joy, from guilt, from every emotion she'd buried for years. She told him she'd leave with him that night. But before she could say another word, a door slammed open. William stood there, watching from the porch, his face pale, his hand gripping a hunting knife. He had heard everything. What followed next, no one knows for sure. Some say the rider tried to reason with him, but William's rage had already taken hold. Others say Lydia begged for peace, but her husband's jealousy burned too deep. That night, the neighbors heard shouting echo from the hill, then a scream so terrible it silenced even the crickets. By morning, the house was dark, its chimney coughing out the last traces of smoke. When the neighbors broke in, they found the parlor burned and broken. Near the fireplace lay William's body, the knife still in his hand, and in his arms, Lydia's lifeless body. Her dress was torn, her throat bruised. He had strangled her, and then turned the blade on himself. The rider was never found. Some say he vanished into the fog that rolled in from the river, riding into the mist and never returning. Others whisper that the river itself claimed him, pulling his sorrow down into the depths where the current never rests. And yet, every October 17th, as the wind sweeps through the bluffs, people in Decatur still hear her, Lydia's scream, echoing from the ruins of the old house that long ago crumbled into the earth. Some say she's still trying to run, still reaching for the man she lost. Others believe she's cursed to relive that final night forever, her spirit bound to the place where love and jealousy collided on sacred ground. If you stand on Blackbird Hill at sunset, you can still see the faint outline of the house in the grass, a hollow foundation, swallowed by the prairie. And when the moon rises over the Missouri River, the air turns cold and the wind whispers a name, Lydia. A love so strong it defied death, a betrayal so deep it scarred the land, and a scream that will haunt Nebraska's hills for eternity. You ever been out on those long, Midwest highways, the kind that stretch so far you start wondering if you're driving through time instead of space, out there where the horizon swallows, the sun and the wind sounds like it's whispering your name? That's where you'll find a place most people don't believe exists anymore. A town called Monowi, Nebraska. Population 1. At least that's what the census says. But out there, under that endless sky, there's something the census doesn't count, something that lingers long after the living are gone. Monowi sits in the far north of Nebraska, right where the prairie starts to swallow civilization. It's a patch of land so empty, so eerily quiet, you can hear your own thoughts echo. No gas stations, no grocery stores, no school. Just a few weather-beaten buildings leaning into the wind, and a single sign that still insists the place is alive. But it wasn't always this way. Back in the early 1900s, Monowi thrived. It was a railroad town, small but bustling. The trains brought people, and people brought life. There was a schoolhouse that rang with laughter, a church where hymns rose up every Sunday, and the beating heart of the town, the Monowi Tavern. It was where stories were told, where fights broke out, where lives intertwined over whiskey and jukebox tunes. It was the kind of town where you knew every face, every story, every secret. But the world moved on. The rail lines shifted. The highways found new paths, and one by one, families packed their memories and left. The laughter faded. The lights went out, and Monowi, little by little, slipped off the map. By the time the century turned, there were only two names left in the census, Rudy and Elsie Eiler. They'd lived there their whole lives, born, raised and married in the same tiny town. Rudy was the quiet type, with kind eyes and a voice that carried warmth. Elsie was tough as nails, quick with a laugh, and proud of the home she refused to abandon. Together they ran the Monowi Tavern. It wasn't fancy, just 4 walls, a counter, and a jukebox that skipped every other song. But it was home. Truckers who passed through the lonely highway knew that bar. They'd stop in for a beer and a bit of company, welcomed by Elsie's sharp wit and Rudy's easy smile. But in 2004, everything changed. Rudy passed away, and suddenly half the town's population was gone. Most people would have left, but Elsie stayed. She said she couldn't go. Not yet. Not when Rudy was still there. Every morning she'd unlock the tavern door, sweep the dust off the porch, and set 2 beers on the counter. One for her, one for Rudy. She'd talk to him like nothing had changed. "Morning, Rudy," she'd say softly. "You wouldn't believe how quiet it's gotten." And maybe it was love, or maybe it was something else, because the truckers who stopped by said they could feel him. The temperature would drop as soon as you stepped through the door. The jukebox would come alive on its own, playing Rudy's favorite old country tunes. And if you looked in the bar mirror just right, you might catch the reflection of a man standing behind her. Broad shoulders, still frame, there one second, gone the next. One driver swore he saw Elsie talking to someone invisible, laughing, gesturing, as if there were 2 people in that bar instead of 1. Another swore that when he turned to leave, he heard a low humming behind him, deep and familiar, like a man singing to himself. When he looked back, there was no one there. But Elsie never seemed scared. She never complained about the flickering lights, the sudden chills, the sound of footsteps in an empty bar. When someone mentioned it, she'd just smile and say, "Well, that's just Rudy checking in." And then, one winter, she vanished. It was 2012. A brutal snowstorm swept across Nebraska, burying everything in white. For weeks, no one saw Elsie. Not the delivery men, not the truckers, not the county clerk who still kept her on the records as Monowi's only resident. When the snow finally began to melt, a sheriff's deputy drove out to check on her. The tavern door was open. The heater was still running. 2 beer glasses sat on the counter, one full, one empty. But Elsie was gone. No footprints, no struggle, no sign of where she'd gone. Just gone. Spring came, and with it, something strange. Out in the old Monowi cemetery, the same place where Rudy was buried, someone noticed a fresh mound of dirt beside his grave. And in front of it, a brand new headstone. Elsie Eiler, born 1930, died. No date, no one knew who placed it there. No one knew who carved it. And no one ever found Elsie's body. After that, Monowi was officially declared a ghost town. Population 0. But people who've been there since, they'll tell you something else. At night, when the fog rolls low and the air turns cold, the tavern lights flicker on. The sound of clinking glasses drifts out through the broken window panes. And if you're brave enough to get close, you might hear a woman's laugh, followed by a man's low hum, the sound of 2 souls still keeping each other company in the afterlife. Some nights the jukebox plays a single song. No power, no wires, just that old familiar tune that Rudy loved. Some say if you stand by the door and listen, you can hear Elsie's voice whisper through the stillness. "Morning, Rudy. You wouldn't believe how quiet it's gotten." And if you happen to drive by Monowi around 2 a.m., look closely, because sometimes, just sometimes, that single yellow bulb above the tavern door will flicker on. Even though the electricity's been shut off for years, the meter still spikes once every night, faint but steady, like someone's still turning on the lights. No one knows why, but maybe it's not so strange, because love like that doesn't just fade. It doesn't stop because the heart does. It lingers. It holds on. Monowi, Nebraska. Population 0, but the census doesn't count ghosts. And if you ever find yourself driving through the dark plains of Nebraska, and you see that flickering sign in the distance, maybe pull over, step out of the car, listen. If the wind feels too warm, if you hear laughter when there's no one around, congratulations. You've found Monowi, a town that refuses to die, because some love stories never do.